Hi there, my name is Carrie Mitchell and I'm the instructional coach for the Larimer campus. In this video, I'd like to talk about motivation for learning. I'm starting with this slide with intrinsic and extrinsic motivation because I think these are the two buckets that all kinds of motivation fall into when we think about motivation. There's that kind of motivation that's coming from within, that sense of drive or passion or something that we want to do or achieve or learn because it's rewarding in its own right. And then there's that extrinsic motivation, those kinds of things that we do in order to earn a reward or to get external validation or maybe to earn a paycheck, right? And so we recognize that both of these things are at play for our students just as much as they are for us. And I think that we could probably agree as educators that intrinsic motion is the gold standard for learning. I don't know that my students ever look quite this intrinsically motivated as these model students here, but I think we've all seen intrinsic motivation to some extent in some of our students in our classes, and we know it, we can spot it when we see it. These are the students who come to class, they're generally eager to learn. You can see that they're working hard, trying to make connections to the material. They may stay after class and ask questions. They may just take their thinking a little deeper, a little further than many other students do. They may not get so caught up in their grade, etc. And so teachers love students who are intrinsically motivated. I think for a long time, I operated under the assumption that students were either intrinsically motivated or not, right? That this was on them entirely, and they came to us either ready to be college students, ready to get the most out of this experience that they were paying for with their time and their money, or they weren't, right? And there wasn't a whole lot that I could do about that, is sort of what I thought for a long time. And now, having studied the science of learning and active learning and all of these things for a while, I'm starting to wonder, what can we do in our role as the instructor to kind of lay the foundation for intrinsic motivation? Can we intentionally design for intrinsic motivation in our classes? Are there things that we can do or be attentive to that could actually promote or spark intrinsic motivation in our students? And if there are things that we could do, what are they and what would that actually look like? So I want to give a shout out to my colleague Brian Kam, math teacher on the Westminster campus. Brian passed this resource on to me through a group called Transcend, which is a nonprofit educational organization focused on science-driven curricular design. Brian, not only does he teach for Front Range, he works with a lot of high school math teachers and mentors them on curriculum design and really following the science and the practices that we're using in the classroom. And so I've been working with Brian this semester, and he passed this awesome resource on to me called Designing for Learning Primer. And even though this is a K through 12 resource, I've done a lot of research on the science of learning, and everything in this learning primer aligns beautifully with the research that is going on right now in the field of learning and brain biology and how we set up learning environments, not just in K through 12, but also in secondary education. So I thought the source was fantastic. And really what it did very nicely is it distills a lot of the research into clear, actionable categories. So I've seen a lot of research on student motivation, but this resource put it in a very kind of friendly, teacher-friendly language and application. So thank you, Brian, for this resource. I am going to be pulling from it a bit during this presentation, and I'll just start with the chapter on motivation from this primer, and here's what the authors say. The hard work of learning requires motivation, the willingness to start, put in mental effort, and persist. Learners don't usually do loads of focused practice for enjoyment. It's challenging. Motivation helps learners get through. So I think that's really important to keep in mind, that actual hard work and learning are draining and demanding, and that it's really that willpower and motivation that a student needs in order to be able to sustain that road that they're on, that pathway that they're on when they're with us. So to answer my question about whether we can design for this, the authors say research that looked across many studies of motivation has found that 4 main factors can drive or block motivation. So what are those 4 main factors? Okay, so the 4 factors that the authors identify that can drive or block motivation are value. So does a student see value in what she's learning? Self-efficacy. Does a student believe in their ability to learn and achieve these goals? A sense of control. Does the student feel like they have some agency over what it is that they're learning and whether or not they can shape that learning to be meaningful? And constructive emotions. So we're going to dig into each of these a little bit more. So let's start with value. And this is where a student sees the value in what she is learning. Maybe we've seen the opposite in our classes. Sometimes students don't really seem to understand how what they're learning in the moment with us is really going to apply to their lives now or in the future. You're getting the sense that they're not really understanding the value. Maybe they're just there to go through the motions, to get the credit for the class, to move on this path that they think they're on. But we know from the research that if a student can identify some value in the experience, they're going to have significantly more intrinsic motivation in how they interact with that experience. And so here are some ways that students can attach value to what they're learning through positive emotions. So if a student is just having fun with a service learning project or some kind of group project in your class, or maybe there's a field trip or something, if they're experiencing positive emotions associated with that learning, then that becomes valuable. And the student can see the value in it. Even if it's not this big long-term goal, it's just something small and exciting in the moment, it still stokes that student's intrinsic motivations. Authentic connections to a student's life. This is important. If a student can see how what they're learning relates to their own life in some way, then the student becomes more excited to learn about this. I remember years ago teaching with a biology faculty. We were in a learning community, and whenever we got to the genetics unit, students always lit up because they got to explore things like their own physical characteristics and why it was that they had dimples or a widow's peak or blue eyes instead of brown eyes. And they could very quickly connect with that material. Whereas when we were studying the structure and function of DNA, students were much more likely to tune out because that was abstract and they had a lot of trouble seeing what the connection was to their immediate experience. And so those authentic connections are really important. Social connections, so it doesn't have to be that the substance is the driving factor. Maybe the student just values looking good to their peers, having fun in their group with their peers, knowing that their social groups are counting on them. That can cause a student to attach value to that learning situation. And then also for our students who are further along in their thinking about where their career is going to be, if they can see how the learning is a concrete step toward their goal in their career, then they tend to be more intrinsically motivated. So somebody in the nursing program might say, I really want to pay attention in this lab today because I know I'm going to be putting IVs in someone's arm and I need to know how to do it well. And so these are driving forces behind whether a student may find value in what they're learning. So how do we design for value? Well, this is a huge discussion, and I'm just going to try to bite off one small piece of it here. So I've isolated this one piece, authentic connections, and I thought I would just share with you a few of the things that I've done that I found have worked really well and that I've seen anecdotally to have a positive influence on students' intrinsic motivation. So I used to sprinkle TED Talks in my composition courses, and students always seem to get really excited. I think TED Talks by nature tend to connect with our students, and they tend to push them to be inquisitive and maybe entertained a little bit. And so my students would always really perk up when we did TED Talks. And so it finally dawned on me, since this is a place where students were experiencing natural connections in the class, maybe I don't need to just sprinkle them throughout my course. Maybe I could actually design a curriculum around the idea of TED Talks. And so now we study TED Talks, we summarize TED Talks, we analyze and evaluate the rhetoric of TED Talks, and then students eventually write their own TED Talks and present them for the class. And so this is a very intrinsically motivating type of course design because students can find their way into it. They tend to get excited about the topics we're looking at. And I can do that because I'm teaching writing and composition, and so I'm able to work my curriculum around it in a way that still allows me to meet all the outcomes of the course. Similarly, in the ethics course that I partner up with in my learning community, the Eric Hub teaches, we noticed that there were certain topics that would push students away and certain topics that would pull students in. And for years, we used some essays on poverty, global hunger, that kind of thing. And we had trouble understanding why students weren't connecting with it because it's such a big, important topic. And everybody feels empathy, right? Like, can't students, connect with this? And then, it started to become clear, I'm going to move my image here, that it wasn't part of students' immediate experience. And so they were having trouble drawing authentic connections. I have a map down here of world poverty rates, and you can see the yellow is the United States, incredibly low instances of poverty. And then here in Africa, very high instances of poverty, a lot of starvation. So we were reading about issues that were happening way over here across the ocean. It wasn't right in front of our students. And when they are only 19, 20 years old, they haven't had enough experience in the world yet. They haven't developed a broader circle of concern or sphere of concern. And so they were really having trouble hooking in to that subject and getting intrinsically motivated about it. That isn't to suggest that it's not an important topic. It's really important. But at this point, what we needed was our students to really get invested in the way we were talking about ethics. And we found that when we talked about things like lying and cheating and other ethical kinds of dilemmas, these are things that our students have already had practice with. They've already had experience with. They probably have lied and cheated at some point. They've probably been lied to and cheated on at some point. And so our students had a lot of experiences, and they got very motivated to talk about those things and learn about the ethical perspectives through those issues. And so we reworked our curriculum to focus more on the topics that students can naturally connect up with. And we found that they're way more intrinsically motivated to talk about, think about, dig into, take risks with those topics than they were with the other topics that were more abstract. We still use some of the more abstract topics, but we don't really focus the whole course on them the way that we used to. Okay, so can you scale up some of these elements that have to do with students valuing your class? So where do your students already make authentic connections in your course? Where could they make authentic connections? So really kind of take a closer look at that. Where do students experience the most natural intrigue in the course? Where are they inquisitive, wondering, excited? Are those places that you could scale up in your course design? Where are students learning concrete skills that they're going to need with their future goals and professions? And how can you help them see the relevance of what they're learning and how it's going to connect to that future goal to kind of push them to feel a little bit more invested and motivated? Okay, so the next element is self-efficacy. With self-efficacy, a student believes that he can grow and achieve a concrete goal. And most of us are familiar with Carol Dweck's work with mindsets, and we know how powerful mindsets alone are in terms of helping students persist, stay involved, stay engaged, keep going, believe in themselves. We know that students often come to us with extremely fixed mindsets about themselves as individuals. So things like, I'm not a math person, or I've never had a brain for science, or mindsets about groups that they may identify with. So this type of group is not good at this thing. Women don't do well in STEM. And so those fixed mindsets and those beliefs go really far to put up obstacles for students' sense of motivation. So mindsets are a really powerful influencer on students' motivation to persist and be successful. And so we need to think about how we're designing for the right mindsets in our class. And we know from Carol Dweck's work that talking about a growth mindset is not enough. We can't just mention it on day one and tell students to do it. We actually need to find a way to design our classes to allow students to experience growth, to see that growth, to know what a win feels like. So how do we design for self-efficacy? These are just some some of the suggestions on the left side here. You can teach students about growth mindsets. In our learning community, Eric and I spend almost 2 weeks on this at the beginning of the semester. And it means that, yes, we do have to sacrifice some of our content for the course, but we find that that time that we invest in having students think critically about growth mindsets and really try to shift into a growth mindset sets the stage for them to really learn deeply and authentically in the class. It's important to normalize the idea of struggle with learning. A lot of students with fixed mindsets believe that if they're struggling, it means they're stupid. They don't want anybody to see them struggling because smart students don't need to struggle. It just comes naturally for them. We all know that that's not true. Anything that you want to learn, you need to work hard at and you need to struggle at. And so how do you praise students for struggling? You know, I know teachers now who will actually say things to their students like, oh, I see this group is really struggling. You all seem very frustrated. That's awesome. It means that you're really doing some great learning today. And so how do you normalize that struggle as part of the process? It's important to set clear, challenging outcomes where students try something and then they get to make mistakes and then they get feedback and then they try again and so on and so forth, because that's how learning works. Oddly, we design our classes in this linear way to give students one shot at seeing something, learning it, and then applying it. And then we're constantly disappointed when they can't do it. But we know from brain science that that's not how the brain actually learns. We know that students need to try something over and over again. They need to get correction, they need to get support, and then they need to be allowed to retry over again if they want to see themselves growing. And if we don't design for that, then we're really just reinforcing those fixed mindsets of saying, well, you only get one try and you can either do it or you can't. You're either born with it or you're not. And so we reinforce those really negative messages. So build in redos. Can you give students opportunities to redo some of the big summative assessments in the class, essays, test revisions, that kind of thing? In order for me to accommodate for this in my own class, I've had to scale back on how many essays I teach. So rather than blazing through 5 essays, I have students write 3 essays and they do it really well and they have to revise them and they have to submit them at least a couple of times and get feedback and make changes. And then that way they can see the growth that they're making and the improvement, and they can start to inhabit more of that growth mindset. When students observe their own growth, it boosts their intrinsic motivation to keep improving. And so I have changed the nature of my comments from being more corrective, this is what you could have done better, to more, this is where I noticed you grew between this try and this try. And so even if a student only jumps from, let's say, a 78 to an 85, I'm still going to focus my comments not on the deficiencies of their work, but on where I saw them working hard and how I saw them growing. And so designing your class for opportunities for growth is really important for self-efficacy. Sense of control. So this one, a student feels that she has some agency to shape her learning experiences in a way that feels meaningful and true to herself. So the quote that I pulled from the resource, since owning your learning is motivating, our environments should create conditions that support it and remove barriers that prevent it. This one I think is tricky because as teachers, I know my nature as a teacher has always been to feel like I am in control of things. It makes me feel safe, but students need to feel that too. And how do I build that into my class? How can I design for a sense of control? So just a few examples that jumped to mind for me. I thought of my colleagues Shauna Jackson and Matt Stillwell, who teach an English Lit learning community. And for one of their capstone assignments, they give students a whole menu of options that they can choose from to show that they've met the outcomes. So they could write an essay, they could do interpretive dance, they can create a piece of art with some narration that goes along with it. And I know there's other choices that I'm leaving off too, but I have gotten to see them collect these projects over the years, and you can tell that students have poured so much more time, thought, care, and effort into these projects than if they were just asked to do one kind of templated assignment that the teacher came up with. And so Shauna and Matt have really done a great job of finding a way to give students a sense of agency over what it is that they're learning while still proving that they have attained those learning outcomes. I'm also thinking of Mike Long, one of my colleagues in history who allows students to select a couple of written response questions from his history tests out of several options. So he may give them 6 options and say, pick the 2 that you want to write on. And I just think that must be so empowering for a student, not to feel locked into having to race through 6 different difficult questions, but really be able to sink her teeth into maybe 2 that she knows a lot about, and to demonstrate her own proficiency in that discipline with those 2 questions. One thing I want to caution against is something called the paradox of choice. And so one of my favorite TED Talk presenters, Barry Schwartz, has written a great book called The Paradox of Choice. And in this book, Barry Schwartz talks about how some choice is really good and gives us that motivating sense of agency, but some choice, when we're given way too much choice, we tend to become overwhelmed and we move into a state of paralysis where we can't make any choices at all. And so I think about this when I go to the grocery store and I'm standing in front of the toothpaste and I need to find the right one, and there's 37 things for me to choose from. It's too much. It's overwhelming to my brain. The same thing used to happen to my students when I would say, pick any topic you want to research. They would often go into this sense of paralysis and they couldn't pick anything. So ideally, you want to put up what the authors of the Learning Primer call guardrails for students. So create a framework where you're giving students some choice, but not endless choice. And then finally, the last of the 4 elements is constructive emotions. And the authors define this as positive emotional states that really open us up to learning. And this one may feel like common sense. Negative emotional states are going to shut down learning. So when we have fear, anxiety, stress, those emotional centers of our brain are really overwhelmed by chemicals that are designed to help us perform in a flight or fight situation. And so our brain is not freed up into a state of learning because we're trying to fight for our own survival, right? So any kind of anxiety or stress or fear that the learning situation or environment is causing is literally closing the brain off to learning. On the other hand, the positive emotional states, a sense of belonging, a student looking forward to coming to class because they're connecting with their peers, a sense of validation, wonder, excitement, any kind of social connections, creates a much more relaxed state for the brain, pulls us out of that fight or flight mode, and is really an ideal place for our brain to learn. And so how do we design classrooms that kind of minimize those negative emotional states and that really helps students step into those positive emotional states? And just a few ideas on this, designing for constructive emotions. How do we create safe spaces and equitable environments where every student feels a sense of importance and belonging? That's really important. I know that our Equity Academy and certain groups on campus are working really hard to help all of us in this area. How do we build a place of collaboration and community where students are not in competition with each other, but where they're helping and interacting with each other to co-construct their knowledge and connect with their peers and teachers? So how do we create that environment? How do we use incentives rather than punitive measures to motivate students? So rather than punishing students, how do we create systems within our grading schemes, little extra credit moments, things that really can let students know that we are incentivizing them, tapping into that positive psychology rather than punishing them, which can kind of put them into that state of fear and anxiety. Praising students when we see them working hard. So just as Carol Dweck suggests that we do. So not just communicating their success to them through grades, but really letting them know, I see you working hard, and I want you to know that it's worthwhile and that I appreciate that and that I think that you're doing the right thing and that, I want to give you some kudos for that. And then finally, when students are really struggling in ways that we can't help them with, how do we connect them up with campus resources, tutoring, support services, mental health, and so forth? And also keeping in mind that emotions are very complex and individualized things, and that we can't necessarily solve emotional issues for students. A lot of their emotional issues are huge and way outside of our sphere of control, but how can we create an environment in our classroom that really sets the stage for students to experience those positive rather than negative emotions? So thank you for hanging in with me for this long video. I just want to say that there's a lot to dig into in these ideas here, and I've only just skimmed the surface. So if any of these thoughts or ideas have piqued your interest and you want to explore them more, then I would just invite you to reach out to one of your instructional coaches. Again, I'm Carrie Mitchell. I'm on the Larimer campus. Eric Salahab is online. We have Catlin Keenan at Boulder and Brandon Stowe at Westminster. All of my colleagues who are instructional coaches are well versed on these ideas, and I know they'd love to explore them more with you. So thanks, everybody.